Welcome to Exception Seekers, the show where we challenge conventional views on youth mental health and explore stories and experiences that offer alternative perspectives. Joining me today is Dr. Rob Meeder, pediatrician and medical director of the Family, Child, and Youth Mental Health at Waypoint Center. I've been really looking forward to talking with you because in following a little bit of your career, seems like you've had a very significant impact on in pediatric mental health, particularly in this work with Waypoint. And just wondered, what drew you into that and how you found your way into this position that you're in right now.
Yeah, no, thanks. That's a good question. There's a long answer and there's a more brief answer, but I'll just say this, that I've been doing pediatrics for 20 plus years now, and my training was in general pediatrics. So, as a pediatrician, you kind of do everything, especially when you move to a smaller city like Aurelia. And so part of that was mental health, and it's kind of what a lot of pediatricians do as part of their general practice. Having said that, we get about as much training in mental health as you might say on cardiology or neurology or nephrology, right? So, and so it's kind of just one more organ or organ system or medical system that you become trained in. And to be honest, and this might vary from one pediatrician to the next, but for a lot of pediatricians, the mental health part is sometimes the most challenging because it is so unlike the rest of medicine in the sense that there aren't really definitive tests and objective tests that you can do that establish a diagnosis, and there's not really something physical that you can prove is wrong or not working that leads to a certain type of behavior or challenging mental health condition. And so the idea of fitting mental health into a medical model it makes it harder to do and makes it less appealing, I think, for a lot of pediatricians, because it just takes more time. It is a little bit less objective, and so I was practicing like that for a long time, and really kind of not prioritizing it as much as maybe I should have. However, then in about 10 years ago, I got an opportunity to move into this more full time because it was becoming a very common area of concern in our population. And for various reasons, I said, okay, let me just try this and see how it goes. And so in 2015, I shifted my practice to a full time mental health practice. But it wasn't my first choice, and it wasn't what I loved to do at the time. But I said, well, if I'm going to do this, I want to do it well. And so I started some extra training, but really what kind of started my shift in this area was around just trying to figure out, like, what are we actually doing here? Like, what are we how does all of this start? And I was really starting to kind of go back and back further in a kid's life and trying to figure out their circumstances, and just figuring out for myself whether the medical model of understanding mental health really made a lot of sense. And my kind of driving question was, when do you first start to get hints of some of these challenging behaviors and issues starting, and what leads to it? Is it something physiologic because we're treating it like it is with medications? um, is it something that is really truly objective, that, and because we're treating it like it is by doing, applying some pretty objective sounding criteria to the mental health challenge that we're seeing? And to kind of fast forward a bit, that was a real eye-opening experience for me, and because I realized that it is really challenging in young kids, especially, to apply a medical model of kind of diagnostic-based thinking to the problems that we see.
Right.
And that led me to changing kind of how I practice. And it really changed also to my use of kind of diagnostic categories. It made me a little bit less focused on more medical type treatments like medications for mental health.
Mhm.
Not that I don't use them, but I use them much more carefully
Mhm.
and sparingly, and always in the context of thinking about things more from a relational perspective, which I'll get into in a second.
Mhm.
So in 2020, I had the opportunity to start up the mental health program here at Waypoint, which is where I'm located now. It's in Central Ontario, Midland, and there was no program before. It was just an adult-based facility, and the opportunity came to start up a family, child, and youth mental health program. So I shifted there, and since that time, we have grown the program. We have a number of child psychiatrists. We still have myself as a pediatrician there, and it's been great because I'm finding that the psychiatrists I work with are like-minded in really trying to do this job well. We're community-based, we're community-focused. We know that a lot of mental health happens at the grassroots in our communities, and so there's been great growth in that area. But personally, I've also grown, and I just completed a fellowship in early relational health, and finding myself drifting towards helping families at earlier and earlier stages more as a way, both because I believe a lot of mental health starts in the very early years,
Mhm.
and also because I know the impact that you can have at that age and that stage of life has real cascading and amplified effects later on in life. And this has been great science and knowledge that's come forth in the last, decade or two, that
Mhm.
what happens at the beginning, what happens in a child's early life, um, is has profound effects later on in life, not just for physical health, but also for mental health.
Mhm.
And so that's what I'm doing now. I really like to take things from more of a relational health perspective,
Mhm.
and I think that has been much more satisfying and probably has kept me personally from kind of burning out. And because I think the medical model for mental health, and especially when it comes to young kids, I think you kind of hit roadblocks, and I think I'm not sure if I would have lasted too long practicing in a way where
Mhm.
uh, you're not quite seeing the success that you're supposed to see. So that's where I am now, and it's been great. We've been able to sort of decrease the wait list quite a bit for families in our area.
Mhm.
We've been working with community partners more. We've been taking a more holistic approach to mental health, a real kind of grassroots community-based approach. And my hope is that we'll see these effects 10, 20 years, 30 years down the road, um,
Yeah.
making an impact not just in kids' lives and families' lives now, but also when they become adults and parents themselves.
Oh, there's so many pieces in there that I want to
Hmm.
learn more about because so much of what you say, I'm picturing, a new grad in pediatrics or someone who's been practicing a long time and it seems like a lot of what you say wouldn't necessarily be within what they've learned or how a lot of them operate, but you're finding a lot of success with it.
Hmm.
It's cool. So it's, I'd be curious you talk about the community impacts that you've seen. Are there certain interventions or approaches or programs that you've been using that you have seen to work really well?
Yeah, yeah. So, like I said, I think a lot of mental health happens early on, and I think the
Mhm.
foundations of mental health are laid in the early experiences that a child and family has. And notice that I'm always saying family and child, child and family, and because I really strongly believe that you cannot see mental health as isolated to a single person. You cannot understand mental health without understanding the relationships within that, within which that child is experiencing the world, and
Mhm.
and how they are creating and laying the foundations for their worldview and their kind of model of how relationships work.
Mhm.
And so that I think has been the biggest shift for me, is realizing that children develop in a context, and that context is concentric circles. It is, primary caregivers first of all, and then it's more immediate family, extended family. And then as the child grows up, more and more of their kind of brain is involved in their development, that other wider relationships start to impact them. And so like I said, it moves sort of through family and close connections to school, and then with peers, and then friends, and then more broadly, other parts of community and society, to eventually where we become adults functioning in our society more broadly, with
Mhm.
very different attachment relationships, etc. So I am a real big proponent of doing more for mental health at that grassroots level, at those first levels. I think sometimes we have been lulled into thinking that mental health is some kind of disease or disorder that you need to go and see your doctor for first of all. And
Mhm.
I think a doctor who understands mental health is probably somewhere down the line, but definitely not your should generally not be your first step. I think
Okay.
for a lot of work that I do, my mindset is more along the lines of, um, not how am I going to help this child, but how am I going to support those who support this child. And that's a that's a concept that is old, actually. It was Winnicott, one of the pediatricians and psychoanalysts from the early or middle of the century before, who really formulated this concept of a holding environment, which is where the mother holds the child. In his case, it was the mother, because that was sort of the
Mhm.
way of thinking 100 years ago. But in really, the caregiver holds a child, but then how do we as clinicians hold the caregiver to hold the child, and how do we kind of approach the relationship, with the family, as one of combined curiosity, of trying to figure out what is happening here, and not just so much as the expert coming in and
Mhm.
prognosticating and diagnosing and sort of just dispensing advice, but really taking a relational lens so that it empowers the caregiver to really gain a deeper understanding of the relationship and of the child, and of the connection that they have with them. And that way, I find a lot of challenging behaviors that lead people to seek help become understandable, and when they are taken in that sort of context and with that sort of lens, because ultimately I want to empower those who are spending the most of the time with the child, and for whom most is
Right.
at stake, to have a relationship that is functional and healthy. um, I mean, I only see kids for an hour or two at a time, and then I don't see them again for weeks or months, or maybe never, because it is a consultation.
Right.
But if I can do something to help the caregiver to promote the relationship, and to help them help their child, I mean,
Mhm.
they're spending 90% of the time with them, right? And teachers would be in the same boat, who spend hours with a child at a time. How do
Mhm.
we help those to help them, and create that holding environment for families that helps them to understand their child, and understand themselves too.
Yes.
And so that's really important, right? To see all these issues as dyadic in nature, because we
Yes.
impact our kids, but our kids impact us.
Yes.
And then that relationship that's in front of us impacts me as a pediatrician. And then I impact that relationship. And
Mhm.
so we can't separate this really relational aspect to mental health that we do. And so I think you can leverage that not just in the clinical relationship, but also in the community. I think
Mm.
we're losing some of that in our very technological oriented world, in a society that's becoming a bit more individualistic, um,
Yes.
and we focus so much on the nuclear family and a little bit less on the extended family, and I think that's at our
Mhm.
loss. I think as humans we evolved in
Yes.
broader communities, and
Yes.
where there were more people involved in bringing up a child. and this
Mm.
idea that we can do it ourselves and we don't need any help, and it's kind of a sign of weakness to rely on other people.
Mhm.
That I think is false, and we need to revitalize this idea that it takes a community and a village to raise a child, and that's
Yeah.
not just a saying. I think there's real truth in that. And
Yes.
so anytime when we see the school community, when we see communities of faith, when we see
Mm.
just other organizations, and I think I'm thinking of summer camps, and
Sure.
really like, hey, look, there's all these opportunities that we have in our immediate community where a lot of mental health occurs just by the day-to-day interactions that we have
Mhm.
with
Mhm.
families and kids. And I
Yes.
think 90% of time, mental health happens in those routine day-to-day interactions, and not necessarily in kind of more structured clinical settings.
I get a beautiful image when you talk about, the caregiver holding the child, but then how do we help hold that person? And I think there's so many pieces in that speak to that those core relationships that they have, and also, that children develop in context and in relation to us.
Mhm.
And so sometimes there's the sense of the child is the one who needs to change or needs support, or right, because what we see are behaviors or things that we maybe don't know how to handle, but they of themselves, it can't be that siloed approach for them. So
Like
yeah.
I said, like, understanding the behavior is I think the first step.
Mhm.
And like I recently had a call from a doctor about a patient that they were seeing and they wanted some advice on, and it was just around a school age child who would have difficulty going to school and having a lot of what we might call separation anxiety.
Yes.
But when you dig a little bit further, that you find out that when that child was first going to school, like in kindergarten, the mother was diagnosed with with a severe illness.
Mm.
And looking back, that's kind of where it started.
Right.
And it almost seems like a no-brainer, kind of looking back in retrospect. But
Mhm.
taking the child's perspective, seeing their primary caregiver possibly at risk and being and even though the mother has gotten better and everything seems to be better, like, why is this child still anxious going to school?
Yes.
Because there's still some very strong feelings that are evoked every time
Mhm.
this child goes to school.
Mhm.
Because so there were some pretty traumatic instances when that
Mhm.
child first went to school, wondering if their mom was going to be okay, and not knowing whether primary attachment relationship
Mhm.
was very fragile and was at
Yeah.
risk.
Yeah.
And to what extent was that internalized in a 5-year old's brain, right? And what did that mean for
Mhm.
them? And
Mhm.
to what extent is that still subconsciously showing up in the relationship now, to the point where this child resists going to school? And the interesting thing, of
Right.
course, is that when they
Mhm.
get to school, they seem to be doing fine. It really is
Yes.
just leaving and this separation that is so anxiety provoking. And like I said, it seems so obvious to us kind of sitting here talking about it, but
Mhm.
it's interesting how sometimes we don't see the links there, or we don't
Mhm.
kind of put the pieces together to say,
Mhm.
like, whoa, that probably has had a much more of an impact than we realize, and probably is still having an impact in a
Yes.
very visceral way, um,
Yes.
on a day-to-day basis. And if we don't understand it from that perspective, if we just think, oh, there's something wrong with the child, there's
Right.
something that, there's a chemical imbalance that needs to be fixed, when you realize,
Mhm.
oh no, it's something much deeper than that. That
Mhm.
it changes your approach to it. And it
Yes.
also, I think, gives you some sympathy and empathy in understanding the relational stress to which this child is really just adapting
Yeah.
in what would be considered a very understandable way. It might not be
Mhm.
like adaptive, functionally adaptive. It might be more maladaptive, because not going to school, that
Right.
has implications, and we don't want
Yes.
that to be the solution. But from the child's perspective, that makes the most sense. I'm going to stay here
Mhm.
with mom because I want to make sure she's okay.
Mhm.
But looking at it from a relational perspective and understanding it first of all, and then moving forward, it's like, well, how can we um, work with helping this child understand that mom's okay and mom's going to be okay.
Yes.
And when the body starts to get anxious in ways that maybe even seems unrelated to the child for whatever reason,
Mm-hmm.
how do we help them calm their body back down and take more of a bottom up or a somatosensory approach to that rather
Yes.
than just explaining, hey, no need to get alarmed. Like,
Yes.
so that may not work when the child is dysregulated, right?
Well, and yeah, and that perspective taking, also recognizes that experiences can happen to us when we're really young, and we might at the time not have the language to explain how we're feeling or even the ability to fully understand what's happening, but we're still
Yeah,
experiencing it. And then as we get a little older, sometimes it comes out in different ways. And
yeah.
sometimes we forget. It's like, oh, but that happened when they were so little. Um, it's
Well, here's
that is
another
a nice,
principle that I
yeah.
think really has really been cemented in me over the last, years, and that
Mhm.
is that three principles. First of all, that experiences shape the brain.
Mhm.
Um, and we know that, there's a genetic component to how your brain is wired, but how how we express ourselves, like a lot of that happens from experiences. The
Mhm.
second principle is that early experiences shape the brain the most. So
Yes.
we know that when the brain is growing rapidly and is dynamically putting all these networks and core regulatory networks into place,
Mhm.
that experiences that happen while that is going on are
Mhm.
the ones that are going to be most shaping the child's brain, with, like I said earlier, cascading and amplified effects down the road.
Yeah.
So it's like the foundations are being laid in those early experiences
Mhm.
that then become the foundation for everything else in life, right? I mean, imagine an airplane taking off from an airport. A small shift in direction early on has a huge impact on the eventual destination versus something that might happen as that airplane gets closer to the next airport.
Yeah.
So those early experiences shape the brain the most. And then the third principle is that early relational experiences are the most powerful experiences. And because there is such a need for this young child to be attached and connected relationally to a caregiver,
Mhm.
anything that might jeopardize or threaten that is given extreme attention. And so a
Right.
child's brain can become very, very sensitized to stress when there are relational stressors in that child's life, to the point where, you know,
Mhm.
and we know this because when if a child has grown up and the first, months and years of that child life have been extremely traumatic, unpredictable, chaotic, and fragile, and then they end up in a very stable, relationship for whatever reason and family
Mhm.
situation, it's very hard to undo what happened in those first few years of life. Versus if it was the other way around, if a child grows up in a very
Right.
stable first few months and years of life, and then the wheels fall off,
Mhm.
the prognosis for a child from a mental health perspective is much, much better. And
Mhm.
so it's not zero, obviously. There still needs to be work done. But
Yep.
when you're starting off with a solid foundation, your
Mhm.
resilience and your ability to tackle significant trauma and stressors later on in life improve greatly versus
Yeah.
if it's the other way around. And so this idea that, oh, babies don't know, babies just forget, or it doesn't, they're not even aware of what's going on,
Mhm.
that's completely false. They are, in fact, I would say, opposite. They are actually more sensitive to what's going on than we realize, even though they may not have a capacity to remember explicitly or to have language around it because they don't have
Yes.
language yet. It all
Yep.
gets encoded into their body and into the to creation of their core regulatory networks that we see it come
Mhm.
out later in all sorts of ways, both physical and psychological,
Yep.
um, to a much greater extent than we realized in the past.
Being a young person can be tough. Raising a young person can be tough. Whether it's school stress, family dynamics, or navigating challenging emotions, everyone needs the right support. That's where Sound Youth Counseling comes in. We specialize in helping children ages 4 and up through individual, parent, and family counseling tailored to meet each person's unique needs. From tackling tough issues at home or school to providing customized workshops and professional development for teachers and community leaders, we're here to make a difference. At Sound Youth Counseling, we believe young people deserve a safe, welcoming, and accepting space to grow and thrive, and every family deserves the tools to support them. If you're looking for support, visit soundyouthcounseling.ca and see how we can help. Sound Youth Counseling, empowering individuals, supporting families, and building stronger communities. As you're seeing this and thinking, even that separation anxiety piece example you gave, or if a parent, if someone is worried about their child, or is just coming up against behavior that, like, they don't know how to help, but it's not, they don't like it. It's getting in
Mhm.
the way of things at
Yeah,
home.
it's challenging. It's challenging.
It's
Yeah.
challenging, yes.
Yeah.
You mentioned that, sometimes the initial go-to is the family doctor, and it might not, maybe they're not always the best position for it. Um, but in many communities, they're the most accessible.
For
You know,
sure.
who in an ideal world, who does the family go to or reach out to?
Yeah, well, so like, and there are, I don't want to get the impression that don't go to your doctor. Like, there are some amazing family doctors that I work with. In fact, most are, and most really
Sure.
want
Yep.
help. And most realize too, like, whoa, this is not really a medical issue, right? this is
Right.
this
Okay.
is more
Yes.
a relational and more kind of a family, a social issue that we need to
Yes.
help out with. And we also have to realize too that my underlying assumption is always that these parents, they love their kids and they want the best for them. And
Mhm.
when things aren't going well, it's usually not because parents are purposefully being mean to their kids,
Mhm. Mhm.
and vice versa. Kids aren't purposely pushing buttons and manipulating their parents to to
Yes.
be obnoxious or mean in any way. And we have to be very careful when behavior is interpreted in that way,
Yeah.
and we have to kind of make sure that we don't see evoked behavior as being something that's done on purpose, just to be bad or mean or
Mhm.
whatever.
Mhm.
Because
Mhm.
sometimes we do see it and interpret it that way, and we have to think, okay, why are we interpreting it that way? And is there maybe a
Mhm.
better way to look at it? And that can happen within families, can happen at schools. Um, so,
Yes.
but all that to say is that so there are many doors to which families will go and knock on when they are looking for help. And I think the most important thing, any door can be a good door if the person behind that door is able to understand that this perspective of
Right.
how where behavior comes from and where challenges come from, and
Mhm.
that they are usually context driven, that often it's a child trying to do the best they can with the tools they have in the situation they find themselves.
Yes.
And so if we are able to take a relational approach rather than a pathologic deficit
Mhm.
based approach, which kind of you know focuses everything in on the child's the problem that needs to be fixed. If
Yes.
we can have someone on the other end of that door, whether it's a family doctor, whether it's a teacher, whether it's a coach, whether it's a grandparent, to be
Yes.
able to understand from that perspective, that's the first step. And then it's like, well, what are the actual challenges?
Yep.
And then sometimes you need a professional. And I see professionals more as wise guides
Mhm.
than as experts who,
Mhm.
who are just there to download, pearls of wisdom. That
Yes. Yes. Yes.
because we're just people too. And you're a
Mhm.
person, I'm a person. I've made mistakes. I'm a dad. I'm a husband. I'm not perfect. I am just trying to do the best I can with my family. And
Yep.
I think sometimes we have an air of expertise around us that's probably not warranted.
Yeah.
And just because I have some initials behind my name and in front of my name doesn't make me any more
Yes.
special. Yes, there's some training I've had and some understanding I've gained and some wisdom I've gleaned over the years.
Mhm.
But I think there's a lot of wisdom I learned from the parents that I sit across too, and the
Yes.
grandparents and the kids.
Yes.
So this, I think we need to
Yes.
be take a humble approach.
Mhm.
Say, look, I'm here to help you understand and to kind of offer what I can,
Mhm.
but we're kind of in this together.
Yes,
And
very much.
that I think helps a lot. And I think that is also, I think that's maybe is going to take a bit. It's a bit of a shift from where the public sees us as well, right? Or where people see us is because sometimes there is this desire for a quick explanation and a quick fix. And I
Yes.
think that expectation is probably our fault because we've
Mhm.
advertised things as
Mhm.
being very clear and objective when
Mhm.
in fact they're not. They're sort of
Mhm.
um, fuzzy and frustrating at times and
Mhm.
ambiguous. And
Mhm.
I think the medical profession doesn't like ambiguity. You know, we like to know things for
Mhm.
sure and we like to prove things.
Yes.
But with mental health, that is often impossible, and everything is much more gray and messy, and that's okay. That's life is like that.
Yes.
But we have to be careful that we don't sell what we do as being more clear than it actually is.
Mhm.
So when you talk about doors, like I just want a
Yeah.
community to have lots of doors.
Mhm.
But what I want is for schools and for medical professionals and for counselors like yourselves to really have a realistic of expectation of what mental health actually is, and that yeah, sometimes there's medical approaches that help when there is intense emotions or feelings that maybe need to be dampened down a little bit, but oftentimes it's a much more holistic approach that needs to be applied in
Mhm.
situations.
You spoke about it with the child of they are often like we are all just doing the best we can,
Hmm.
with what we have at the time and that idea of, for parents too. And I think that recognizes I think sometimes there's I imagine a hesitancy, right, in reaching out because sometimes there's the idea that, well, if I'm asking for help with my child, then I'm obviously not good enough. Maybe there's something I'm doing wrong, or maybe it speaks to like my ability as a parent
Yeah.
when, it's if someone else is able to offer an idea, sometimes it's simply because they're not enmeshed in that relationship. They have an outside perspective.
Yeah, I talked about Winnicott earlier on, and one of his other
Mm,
famous insights was his concept of the good enough parent.
mm,
And and I
mhm,
I've had more than one moment where I sat across from a family and said, look, we're not asking you to be perfect. And there's a lot of pressure on parents to be perfect and do things right and to not mess things up. Um, we
mhm,
actually don't want perfect parents because that is A, impossible. And
mhm,
B, that is actually not what kids need for healthy development. They need a parent who is good enough. And that whole concept of good enough parent, it strikes people as going like, what the heck are you talking about? Like, I just need to be like second best or second
mhm,
rate or just okay or mediocre. No, 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 that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that good enough means that there's going to be mismatches in your relationship and there's going to be some ruptures and you're going to do some things wrong.
mhm,
And actually, that is really important for healthy development because it's the repair that develops us. And kids need stressors to develop appropriately. They're not going to become resilient if they haven't experienced some stress, and that includes relational stressors.
mhm,
And so if we take off the pressure that we have to do everything right, that, if we kind of do, if we mess up here, or if we've raised our voices at our kids, or we have not been
mhm,
available when we should have been, or we missed that practice, or that's going to happen. And our ability to work that through with our kids and to repair those ruptures and to talk about it in a healthy way, that's really what's going to set them up for the future. Um, and so, good enough is better than perfect. And so, let's give each of us some grace that, we don't want toxic stress, right? So, you're not going to
right,
neglect your
right.
kids and you're
Yes.
not going to beat them and you're not going to
Mhm,
like, you
mhm,
know, be that parent. But you are going to be a parent who wants the best for their kid and you are going to mess up sometimes. And that's
yes.
actually perfectly fine. And in fact, I would say is necessary for healthy development.
Well, it's reassuring and, kind of calming in a way, right? To say
Yeah,
there's this idea of perfectionism among parents, and it's not attainable
yeah,
and
yeah.
not what's going to be best.
And maybe that will set off a bit of
Mm,
thinking in the parent themselves too, like, well,
mhm.
why is it that I am so concerned about being perfect and doing
Right.
everything right? And what is it? What do I bring to the relationship? And being able again to just dial things back a bit and saying like, what's going on around a child, and that's
Mhm,
the most important thing going on in a child is the caregivers, right, and the immediate family. And I think sometimes it's important that we go there and we ask the parents like, what was modeled for you? Where what's your story of how you got
mhm,
to where you got? And what was your support like when you felt depressed after you had your child, or
mhm,
when you were growing up, and what experience of stress and trauma? And oftentimes we find that there is, I think the experience of significant stress and trauma in childhood is more common than we realize. And
mm,
that intrudes on parenting down the
mhm,
road in
mhm,
probably very subconsciously, but because we want the
mhm,
best for our kids, we want to protect our kids from what we experienced that was maybe not healthy. And so being able to go there when you have a relationship, it's not like what you do on like, meet and greet.
mhm,
But
mhm,
that's why I just feel like those who are working in the profession, who are dealing with families that are really having a lot of difficulties, we need to get to that place where we can go a bit deeper and as pediatricians, sometimes we focus just on the child, right? But this concept of like seeing the family and
mhm.
talking with the parents about, well, what is your history? And sometimes they've never had a chance to talk about that or to explore that,
Yes.
and just doing that in a very non-judgmental way can sometimes be
Mhm,
very eye-opening for them to realize,
mm,
oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense, like this is what I went through. And it's no
yes.
wonder that that is sort of seeping into,
Mhm,
almost by osmosis, into my current parenting relationship with my own child.
mhm.
And giving some voice to that and some recognition to that is sometimes goes a really, really long way into allowing parents to give themselves some grace too.
Mhm.
That this is not, you're not doing anything wrong. You're simply doing the best you can with the tools that you have,
Yes,
like the child has
yes,
too, right? So,
yes. I want to this might be a go back in time a little bit perhaps question,
mhm,
but it's one that, I ask everyone that I talk with because it's around this idea of exception seeking and sort
mhm,
of your path into what you did, and you spoke a little bit about what led you into your current role, and in that story, it's clear that you saw that there was a different need than
mhm.
that needed to be met than kind of maybe how your training was, and you followed that. Prior though, what gave you the confidence or this idea to say, if I see something different, I'm going to go find a way to do it?
Yeah, well, I think for me personally, like I said earlier, like if I had gone on in sort of doing what I was doing and how I was actually trained to do, I think
Mhm,
I would have burned out because this that experience was really challenging. I think it's why many pediatricians don't like to do mental health, is because you're doing it, and
mhm,
um, it just feels like you're not really having the impact that you want to have and be the help that you are, and really be able to go and dig a little bit deeper and get a little bit closer, um, and and really have the impact that you want to have. um,
mhm,
and that can be really distressing, right, when we just see things getting worse despite our best efforts.
right.
And so I think that's what led me to get, that's got to be a different way.
Mhm,
And so I just kept scratching at that and figuring out like what's underneath this that I need to get at and understand
mhm.
better. in order to really feel like I'm being helpful. And it started with like just reading a couple of books that gave me a different perspective on behavior, reading self-reg and explosive child and whole brain child and
Yes.
almost being embarrassed that these books had been out there. And I'd actually been recommending them to parents and hadn't actually delved into them myself to the extent I should have, to realize that there are many places where people are trying to get us to understand what we see through different lenses,
Hmm.
and that led me to the relational health aspect, and to where I am now, to the point where I feel like I'm able, in the program that I am in now with at Waypoint, I'm able to take the time to really do it more service. I still feel like I wish I could do it more
I'm
and to
sure.
have more
Yeah.
time, but there's always pressure to there's a wait list, and the referrals keep coming.
Yes.
But I hope this is just a start of being able to do something like this better, to really take a family oriented relational approach,
Mm-hmm.
to get away from this concept of, the child is the patient and that's the center of our focus.
Hmm.
Because ultimately, I'm still working in a system where the chart in front of me is of one person, it's of the child.
Right.
And
Yes.
what can we do down the road? Like, how can we really see this as more of a
Hmm.
family issue and family based
Hmm.
consult? And then really, like, how can I empower the systems that are around us to really make long-term societal change happen, um, so that because I think in Canada, I think we have an opportunity to do it. I know countries that do this better. I was speaking yesterday at a conference and pointing out how many of the Nordic countries, in Finland and Sweden and Norway, they're always the happiest countries in the world. Every time you rank them and you do these scales, and these organizations do these rankings of the world happiness, they're always at the top.
Yes.
And you wonder why. It's because there's a high degree of trust in those societies and communities. To them, people are trust other people to think the best of them and to do the best for them. And I strongly, strongly believe that trait of trust is developed at a very, very young age. I think it starts with the parent, the child, and the caregiver.
Hmm.
And that builds a character. Just like we know trauma is embedded early on in life, trust can be embedded early on in life as well, right? It's sort of the flip side of that. And
Hmm.
so I feel like we can build a society where we trust each other more, when it's less polarized, where we're less cynical, where we're more flexible, and we can kind of see the gray and not everything so black and white. That's kind of what I ultimately wish for, is that
Yes.
we're building a next generation of families where we trust one another more, and where we just do think the best of each other, and not just assume that it's just every man for himself and it's more individualistic, and the
Mhm.
ultimate goal is to be richer and have more money, because we know that doesn't bring really happiness. So
Mhm.
I think maybe that's my motivation, is how do I work with not just one family at a time, but maybe with the systems that
Yeah.
are impacting our kids every day and our families every day, to
Yes.
strive towards something better down the road like that.
Well, I am very glad you're doing what you do
Oh, thanks.
because it's needed, and we need people in platforms of, where they have the ability to make change to drive that. So, yes, I am glad you're doing what you're doing, and I look forward to seeing what comes next.
Mhm.
Where you go with it. I think it's needed. And I think the approach you have is so important for families that are struggling in any
Thanks.
capacity. So,
Yeah, and thanks, Colleen. And I'll just point out that I know that you're doing great work there too, in your region there in Perry Sound, and probably beyond. So, um, and I'm just glad that this seems to resonate with you, so I know that this is probably part of how you work as well. So I'm glad to hear that. And it takes people in like kind of one person at a time to sort of understand this is what's needed. And so I really appreciate the work that you do and the interest that you have in talking with me about it today. Thanks.
Well, thank you for your time.
My pleasure.
Yeah. So, how do you wrap up a conversation that was so full of key information and just brilliant ideas? And I am very grateful to Dr. Meeder for that. When I think of things that he said and sort of my own framework for working with youth in the role that I do, I think what I will take away with, what really resonated with me was just the reinforcement of the idea that we have to look at individuals within their context, within their environment, within their family unit, within their school system. That this idea of youth mental health is really not so much individual mental health as it is community mental health, system mental health. And so as an adult who interacts with young people, what's my role? What's our role as a collective to be able to surround that person with the resources and supports that they need? And I think the other thing that I was left with is that we're just going to have another conversation with Rob, because there was too many things in that I want to know more about, and too many questions that I had that I didn't have time to ask. So let me know your thoughts, and thanks for listening. Thanks for listening to Exception Seekers. Tune in again as we continue to seek overlooked stories that offer new perspectives, disrupt limiting beliefs, and inspire transformative approaches to nurturing youth mental health.
This podcast was produced by North Star Networks, the guiding light for progressive media.